every week by the pastors of Living Springs. Thanks for tuning in.
Good day, Q&A people.
Hello.
We are here and ready, but we are not live today. Typically, we are live on this.
Yep.
But if you're watching this, we recorded this the week before.
Yeah, we are recording on June 21st. This will go live the 28th then.
That's right.
We announced, in case you missed it, we're going every other week for the summer, both to just make sure we don't do too many podcasts without Doug, because he's a part of this podcast, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that enjoy his perspective. So to go every week for 8 weeks while he's away would be a lot of missed Doug.
That's true.
And he'd be just, if he's watching the podcast, I don't know if he is, there'd be a lot of opinion just boiling up in his head.
Yes.
That we'd have 3 episodes of AER by the time he came back. No, just kidding. And then also just to recognize that Blake and I will be away at different points.
That's true.
And that's why we're recording this one early. So a podcast with just one of us would be...
That would be weird.
It'd be weird. So we're planning ahead to go every other week, not to miss Doug too much. And so we're recording this one ahead today. And if there's something crazy in the world that has happened that we're not addressing, that's why.
Yeah, we apologize for that.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, we got good questions, as always. So let's jump in.
We got some AER to kick us off.
All right.
So Keelan, hit that clip. Time for accusations, explanations, and recantations. That'd have been a real jerky thing for me to say if the clip didn't work, so I'm glad it worked.
That worked great. All right, number 1. Hi, pastors. Twice today you mentioned the name of a podcast. I didn't quite catch the name of it. What was it, please? Thank you, Lorraine.
I'm assuming this was BEMA.
I assume it was BEMA as well.
BEMA Discipleship is what you'd search for under podcast. BEMA Discipleship, as it's always spelled, with Marty Solomon. I think Marty's name's in the Q&A the description as well. BEMA Discipleship with Marty Solomon, I think, is on the graphic at the very least. You will have your mind blown.
Yes, you will.
Yeah. Well worth it. We may never see you tune into this podcast again once you've found BEMA.
I found a better one.
So I'll just say goodbye now. Thank you for following up with us.
All right, second one. I feel very conflicted as a regular WM, that's women's ministry here at our church, attender about the upcoming bonfire. Is it in poor taste to be hosting one when most of the province is on fire? I'm not trying to be negative, and I've come to all the WM events for years now, but I wonder if others have the same thoughts.
So Swing came in, but I wanted to prioritize it based on timing.
Yep.
So this came in last week after the 300th episode, so we couldn't address it on there. And because we're recording this ahead, this is only going to come out with 2 days notice before this event takes place. So sorry we couldn't address it sooner. I think there's actually been some effort to address a similar concern on the Women's Ministry Facebook page as well, just to get the conversation going. But I thought it was worth addressing in person. So, one, we've actually had a bunch of rain since this question would have come in.
Yes.
So I hope that also changes things. But even before that was a known fact, we had recognized the fire ban and we would not want to do anything that was counter to it. So we have a number of different options. Even while the fire ban is on here in Airdrie, what is permissible is using gas fireplaces, which are in theory and practically used no different than a barbecue.
Yeah.
The propane ones that then hook up. And even then, to be as cautious as possible, we were aiming to, if the fire ban was on, do that on the pavement, not on the grass.
Yeah.
Just to be as cautious as possible. I totally get where this concern's coming from. And to be honest, if it had been considered unwise and we had promoted the event, really the event is not all about fires. It's about getting people connected.
That's true.
I'm sure there would have been no hesitation for us to have just gone, we set it to fire. Nobody's going to leave if we don't have fire and just sit in our lawn chairs around in a circle to talk. The point is connection. So we were very cautious of that. I totally get it, especially concerns for others. We were going to make sure to honor all possible restrictions that would have been out there.
Yeah, I agree. I'm thankful that we have people that are concerned and paying attention to stuff that is important. So
yeah,
that is good.
Cool.
All right.
Speaking of BEMA podcast.
Now we have our questions. And the first one is about BEMA. The BEMA podcast seems to keep coming back to this idea that God is a God of rest and that he focuses a lot on having his people rest in him. I'm wondering what it means to you to rest like a Sabbath, but also what it means to you to rest in him.
Great question. Glad to hear we've got more BEMA listeners and that you still listen to us even while listening to BEMA. I've prioritized BEMA over all my other podcasts at this point, so I would get it. Yeah, practically speaking, rest for Sabbath. This is one that Allie and I have a continuous wrestle with. Because a modern day, we've, like in our household, we've got shift worker in my wife. So we can't say every Friday evening through till Saturday at dark, are we going to honor Sabbath, because her schedule is rotating and changing all the time. So with that, we try to be really cautious to make sure to prioritize times of rest within our family and within our time together. The way our family has worked out and some of the priorities we've made is trying to not have our kids in childcare or as little as possible. But yet we aren't at this place where we can financially manage having somebody at home full time. So one of us is always heading out the door while the other one comes back in, really. We're two ships in the night often, passing the kids off. But what that's allowed is times of rest that when we're home, we're all in with the kids, whatever adult that has been. And so we regularly have chats and accountability about what that looks like to spend time with them and celebrate that. I do want to address, too, that though we try to have that until we do family movie night most Friday nights, and we're trying to even pull back away from the screens more often, so not even family movie nights as much as just family nights. And we've done just different kinds of foods that are easy to make and have on the table and play card games. And we've been doing a lot of bike rides this summer, just doing that way. But the idea of rest goes more beyond just not doing things as well. That tied into the idea of Sabbath. The idea of not working on a day for Sabbath was also pointing towards, I must then trust that God is my provider to not work. And so that also then plays into things about generosity in our life, continuous commitment to giving to the church, that we could easily have that money back in our account and be okay with that really quick. Yeah. But continuing to trust God as my provider and resting in him means I'm going to rest and trust in his provision. And so there's lots of ways beyond also just with our time that it means for us to rest in him. I'll have more to say about it. I'd love to.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I love that you just said that about the provision, like trusting in God. Yeah. My dad is a farmer, and that was just his thing. Like, our equipment did not move on Sundays. Right. And we had hired hands over the years. We had, people in the community or even well-intentioned Christians that would be like, it is going to rain tomorrow, like Monday or whatever. Yeah. You should probably just work. And my dad, I don't know if it was legalistic or whether it was just a discipline, but it was ingrained in me and my brothers, I think, really well, that we just, you just trust God. Yeah. Like, if God says this is the way you should live, then we just believe that. And that has been something that I've tried to do even with my children, as you've done, Kyle, with me and my wife, like trying to always trust that God has got us, right? So whether it's rest, whether it's with the money, whatever it is, if he's set a standard and we can see it biblically, then we need to trust that he's got the rest, right? Yeah. And then the physical rest, that has changed. It's been seasons, just like you're in, Kyle. Your kids are little, mine are older, but we've gone through different rhythms that way. Yeah. Hockey was a big one for us. That our kids played hockey, but it was hard to, now you take a day off because Sundays you're going, right? Yeah. But be really intentional about the times, like you say, when we had time. Yeah. Like, as soon as we realized we had a calendar date that there was nothing on, then we just guarded that really hard. And like you say, we'd do family things or do whatever, or do nothing. That was something that I really tried to do with my kids. And I think for some things they got it, but just that you don't always have to have a full schedule. Yep. Right? It's okay to not have something on Monday night, or it's okay to even have a couple hours today where we're doing nothing. And, the kids would ask, what are we doing? What are we doing? And it's like, nothing. Yeah. Like, go find something to do or do nothing, right? Yeah. And then personally for me, it's been seasonal in a lot of ways, but for me, it's every morning. Like, I try to do time with God in the morning that's just restful, that's good. I do take naps when I can sneak them in. And then the resting in God, I think, is a different question. But that's a routine as well, where I think there's lots of Christian disciplines. Like there's reading your Bible, there's praying, there's being in silence, and then there's a lot of other things as well. I think giving myself permission to just explore those things.
Yeah.
Because for a long time, I just had a really regimented read my Bible and pray.
Yeah.
And I didn't like praying as much as I liked reading my Bible, so I'd read my Bible more.
Yeah.
But now, like, silence has become one. I'm not a music buff in any way, but I go through seasons where I'm like, it would be good for me to just sit with worship music on.
Right.
Because I think it's just healthy to try different things to connect with God.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's
cool.
That's kind of that. I don't know.
Yeah. I think resting in God often is seen, or at least growing up for me, hearing such language was very much described as a passive thing. I would now call Sabbath or resting in God, it is active protest. Is really what I'd describe it as. Like you're talking about the busyness of schedules. Yeah. For us, we've said to our kids, you get to pick one thing. Yeah. And that's what we do. So that we ran into a conflict already. Like our kids are young, and it's like, but I want to do this and this. Yeah. Then pick. Right. Like, active resistance to the busyness and the ways of this world, to then have trust in God and stillness in those things. For us, it's been easy to just put on the movies on Friday nights, and I'm sure we still are going to do so. Especially in the winter months here in Canada.
Absolutely, yeah.
But at the same time, to, again, actively resist just the defaults of the way that our world typically goes, so that we can lean into God and the blessings he's given us in our family and relationships. I've been challenged by a friend here, and if you're listening to the podcast, you'll know who you are, of aiming to also include others in this. And then the way that they celebrate Sabbath is to make sure not to take Sabbath away from somebody else.
Oh, yeah.
So they won't order food out on Sabbath. Right. Yes. They'll have prepared it themselves, so their Sabbath isn't sustained by somebody else having to work. Right. Which is like really intentional. And I think that's just so thoughtful. Yeah. And so there's different ways you can get deeper and deeper into Sabbath. And I believe, and I would encourage people to be listening to the Spirit. And it's not easy. It's not just going to happen. Right. There's a book I read. This is a problem with reading too many books. It was by a Messianic Jewish author, and she just kind of rediscovered her Jewish roots as a follower of Jesus. And so they leaned completely into Sabbath, like from Friday night when sun goes down, there's no cooking, there's no driving for them, everything. They went full tilt. And there was an active fight for them to get to there, but they found so much blessing in it. Yeah. I would encourage everybody, in whatever way you can, start leaning into more of that. And it's not a passive thing, but you quickly realize the frustrations in your own heart and mind of our obsession with productivity and entertainment in today's world, that to push away from both of those for time with God and stiller things is really hard. Yeah. But it's meaningful. And so fight for it in whatever way you can.
Well, I love the BEMA language too, is this idea that our value is not in the things we do, but in the fact that God just created us. Yep. So we can rest and have just as much value as we would if we were ticking off a bunch of boxes doing good things for God.
Totally.
Right? And I appreciate that language. Yeah. I think of, Jesus' words, the Sabbath is for man, right? Yeah. Those kind of images. I do have one story I remember years ago. For some reason, we had two services and I had to run home between a church service. Yeah. And as I was driving home, one of my neighbors was mowing their lawn. Yeah. And I was like, oh man. I was like, that guy can spend all Sunday morning mowing his lawn because he doesn't go to church. Like, so that's so wonderful, because my lawn was like a foot tall and I hadn't had time to cut it. Yeah. And then the next thought that went through my brain, which was so awesome, was just like, what? Yeah. Why would I rather be cutting my lawn than spending time doing nothing or going to church or just resting in God? And I was like, that's pretty freeing. Like, I don't have to do anything when I choose whatever that Sabbath looks like or whatever that rest is. Yeah. I'm allowed to. Like, my God actually gives me permission to not have to do things or perform or find value in. Yeah. Since I started listening to BEMA, I try and text my kids every week, and I usually do it Sunday morning. So if you're watching me sitting at the front, I usually send a text while worship is going on, just with that phrase that he tells his kids. We rest, we play, we are loved by God. Yeah, I love that I think it was the first or second episode where he was talking about that. Because I just want my kids to know that too, that they're loved.
Yeah.
It does not matter what they do. They do not have to accomplish anything to be loved by God.
Yeah. And that's going to be hard to accept. I was reading a book earlier this week, and the pastor, it was huge. He was writing on spiritual disciplines and spiritual growth and maturity. And he was saying how he went on a sabbatical, and it was 2 weeks in that he's still feeling just crazy anxiety, just not doing anything.
Right.
Like he was so trying to fight for the ability to actually receive that you're not just going to do this and go, God loves me. He's awesome. Like that's not going to happen. You're going to have to, like I said, actively protest the need to be productive in order to find that rest in God and his love for you, but it's worth it.
And I would say, if I'm giving a little bit of practical advice, you can start small.
Yeah.
Right? Like I'm like this, and I watch one of my sons do this because he's just like me or his dad.
Yeah.
But like as soon as he gets an idea, he's like full in, right? So if I'm going to start working out tomorrow, it's going to be like a 10-hour workout, and like, I'm going to watch videos about it and everything.
Totally.
And you're never going to keep that up, right?
Yeah.
But if you want to start doing this Sabbath thing, like cut out, I don't know, 5 minutes in a day, or cut out,
turn your phone off for an hour a day.
Yeah. Just do something small.
Yep.
And it will be hard.
Yep.
Absolutely. But yeah, build the resolve and the discipline in the small things, and then shoot for greater.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. Awesome.
All right. Next question. I guess you're waiting for me to read that.
Do you want me to read to you? I feel like we can rotate. We've just assumed that you keep your host role.
You asked me a question.
Okay, well, this is what I normally do when you're away, and Doug, we go back and forth, so it's not just one person always have an answer. All right, Blake, do you think the mainstream church is dying? I wonder if that meant mainstream or mainline. Anyways, we can discuss that.
Yeah.
And if so, is it because some churches can't adopt to a more modern outlook or times? Is this a post-COVID symptom we should see change in?
I got lots of thoughts there, and I bet your mind is turning as well, Kyle.
Oh, yeah.
And probably lots of questions for you, and you can ask them back or whatever. But I had a conversation actually with a former pastor this past week, and kind of same idea is just church is really diverse. And I've grown to learn that.
Yep.
I think like anybody, or maybe I'm not as good as anybody, but I live in my little bubbles all the time in my worldview, and I just assume everything is the same as that.
Right.
So a few years ago, before I started working here, I was working at a larger church that was very involved with a lot of other larger churches, like, churches of 1,000 or a couple thousand.
Yeah.
And it was always that talk about this is the church.
Yeah.
And even in that moment, I realized, hang on, this is like a small percentage of churches, and now so even more so.
Yeah.
Like even if I drive down the highway or drive through Calgary,
Yeah.
there's a lot of church buildings that hold, 100 or 200 or less people.
Yeah.
And I'm like, they are churches too, right?
Totally.
So when you talk about, one piece of the church dying or whatever, I just don't know that our language applies to all churches and all demographics.
Yep.
So I just say that first. But as I think the questioner is asking this question, yeah, I think church is changing drastically. I think the way that people think is changing. We've moved from a modern to a postmodern worldview.
Yep.
Like there's just a lot of things that are happening. I'd say for me, and you can say whatever you want, Kyle, but I just think one of the things that's changed in my time and my generation that I see between my parents and my kids, I would say I'm kind of in the middle, but I look at my parents who just did whatever the leaders of whatever told them to do.
Yep.
So if a pastor preached and said, this is the way it is,
Yep.
my parents were like, that's the way it is.
Yep.
I look at my kids and they're like, why?
Yeah.
Like they just question everything.
Totally.
And it's a way different way of thinking.
Yeah.
So I would just say if a church is going to continue to just think that we can just stand on a pulpit and preach and that the world will be saved, I just don't think that will happen. I think proof of a little bit of that, and again, the church is diverse, so I don't know what piece of the puzzle I'm talking about or pie that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But I would say we are aware that we're getting more listeners for a podcast than we get to our Sunday morning gatherings.
Yep.
So obviously this platform is taking on a different way of spreading, hopefully, the gospel. Like hopefully we're presenting Jesus in a way that people are trying to follow him better.
Hope so, yeah.
But yeah, I would say I don't know if dying is the right word, but church is changing.
Yeah, that's a good caveat.
Yeah.
I think again, perspective is a big part. So right now there are massive revivals and church growth happening in South America, in Africa, especially Central Africa. There's a lot going on in the church globally. Asia as well, massive. So I heard this a while ago, and it really stuck out with me. If you averaged out what the average Christian looks like right now, it's a South American woman.
Yeah.
That is who the average Christian is.
Right.
If you globally who that is. That's not what we think of in our North American context.
Yeah.
To be honest, I would say even within our congregation, I think this would apply to most Western churches, would be a kind of middle-aged female. Still, because the church is heavily more female than it is male.
Yeah.
That I'd assume to get really specific, I'd say we'd probably have a middle-aged white female. Would be the average church attender at this point. So that's just different context to what globally the church is.
Yeah.
And so we have shifted and changed, and the conversation might be different from mainline to mainstream church, to clarify those. I did see the POC release a thing earlier this year that the Pentecostal denomination is one of a few, very few right now, churches that are reporting growth numbers. And they were quick to clarify that's not necessarily because we're seeing a bunch of new salvations or even church transfers. It was specifically over refugees and immigrants who are coming in from other parts of the world and have been a part of a Pentecostal church in their context. Look for that name on the door and go there. So with that, what that's saying is internally amongst our churches, other than these extra people coming in from outside, we're also dying. That yes, the church in the West is, I think, dying, and I think it's the result of things that have been stewing for probably 70 to 100 years that we are now seeing at their fullest extent. Even just the change in the view of pastors in society. Pastors, we used to be trustworthy people. Known for that and seen as a positive impact in our communities. I think the way that churches have gone, pastors are hardly involved in their communities outside of their churches. And with all the negative spotlights that have gone on, we are definitely not looked at. We're looked at it with a lot of caution and hesitance. So what's the scandal going on behind this guy or girl? So there's a lot that's changed culturally there over the role of the pastor and around churches. I think churches have, to maybe steal some of Jesus' language, have lost their saltiness in our culture. The ability, just to play out the analogy, to add flavor and to preserve goodness in culture, we have now often lacked flavor. To say the church was supposed to be this diverse blending of all sorts of people, and now we've got a very average demographic within its own walls. And then to preserve goodness in culture like salt would have in the day when Jesus said that, we often now are caught up in culture wars instead of preserving goodness. We fight against things in culture is what we're so known for.
I just had a thought as you were saying that. I think, and I'm not saying this is the answer in any way, but it just kind of struck me. Like, Doug and I, for sure, a little bit older than you, but we've talked about growing up in churches where end times was talked about a lot. The belief that Jesus is coming back soon. And whether it was preached, because I don't remember it being preached this thought, but there's a consequence of thinking this way. And it's kind of a circle the wagons, get everybody in, and just wait for Jesus to come back. And then he hasn't. And now we've pulled away from culture and society enough that we've kind of lost saltiness, right? So we need to get back into that, right? We need, and I think the churches that I am aware of that are thriving, whether they be a little tiny rural community or, some mega church somewhere, they have a real place in their community.
Totally.
And those are the ones that seem to thrive.
Well, that's dispensational theology at its core. So there's a book that I have been meaning to read. If anybody's out there listening going, hey, I would love to buy Kyle a gift, you can buy me this book. I haven't pulled the trigger on it yet. The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, where they're talking about how dispensationalism is the age is about to be done. That's that, like Jesus is coming back anytime. So what the theology was literally preached was we need to stop worrying about making this world better because Jesus is coming back. We've just got to save souls.
Yeah.
And the distinction between saving souls and impacting lives was drawn.
Two different things.
Right? And
Yeah.
so instead of changing society, we don't have time for that. We just got to get people in.
Yeah.
Was very much, and that's where massive focus on evangelism and tent meetings became, let's just get people to put their hands up and accept Jesus because he's coming back soon. And we stopped, and actually now we're seeing it. Again, this is back to that whole idea of we're seeing things that have been bubbling for a while at their fullest. Now you've got a lot of church circles who are actually actively protesting and speaking against social justice. I don't know if you've come across this, but there are many churches and sites, and I won't list any by name, who are actively calling out and saying it is unbiblical to be concerned with social justice. Because we're supposed to be about the gospel and not about other things.
Yeah.
And so that language is outright.
Wow.
And so we have, I think, really missed the mark. And so, of course, people are not going to be drawn into the way of following Jesus that we're offering, because I don't think we're following Jesus the way that he intended us to do so. The church has, at its best, it's never all been all this because it's always had humans involved. But at its brightest moments within history has made a difference and an impact on its world for better, for people to live more fully here and now in the culture that they find themselves. That has happened in geographic pockets. That has happened in time pockets within our world, where the church has made life better for a group of people while it's outside of itself, and shown Jesus by showing his love and care for this world and the people that exist in it. And I think right now we are so stuck looking at our belly buttons. Of course, nobody's interested in having us.
My wife, who I like to give props to,
Yeah.
'cause she's way wiser than me, said something the other day. We were talking about church and all this. I think she was even listening to our 300th podcast, and maybe that's where it came from. But she just said it's interesting that in my mom and dad's house is Decision Magazine, and on every cover, it's always like 3,000 people gave their life to the Lord in wherever, because they're always out on these crusades, doing these big concerts and inviting people to give their lives to Jesus.
Yep.
And to some extent, that's really exciting, right? That people are getting saved. I always question, what's the discipleship process after that? And that's kind of what my wife was saying. She was saying it the other way around, but she's like, so we celebrate as Christians that many people got saved this past weekend in Papua New Guinea or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And it's like awesome that those people got saved.
Yeah.
And we believe, this is my wife's words, we believe they are saved, going to heaven. This is awesome.
Yeah.
And yet, the same people that make that claim would come into their own church and see somebody that is on the other side of some divisive thought or lifestyle that they don't agree with and be like, that person is not saved. They're going to hell. They don't have it figured out. They need to get their life straightened out.
Totally.
And it's like, those are contradictory thoughts, right?
Yep.
Because nobody knows what the guy overseas or wherever in this Papua New Guinea or anywhere else.
Yeah.
Nobody knows what their lifestyle looks like or whether they're living for the Lord or not.
Yeah.
But they got saved, so they're saved.
Totally.
But my buddy who's sitting beside me in church,
Who disagrees on this, that, or the other thing.
he is not saved anymore.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's an odd thought.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I'm just kind of trying to go back to the question. Make sure.
Sorry, I got
no.
rabbit trail there.
I think that's right. I'm just trying to make sure we address it all. I would say the adopting to modern times or outlook is not necessarily a concern of mine. I believe we have received and inherited a gospel and a message that is timeless, but its practices and expressions need to find their way to speak to each people in each time.
Yeah, that's a good way to say that.
Right.
Because, yes, the flip side to, I think, the danger, like we always think about that pendulum swing, right? Where we miss the middle so often. Yeah. So if we see that, the gospel is what's being preached and it's just about the gospel, getting people saved, and we're like, okay, hang on, we need to get with the times. So we move back into culture and move into people. Well, then it's a race against, can we be the most trendy, or can we be the most popular, or can we be the most culturally relevant? Yeah. And then we're missing the other side of it, right?
Yep.
It's so, yes, that's not what we should be about as Christians.
No. The megachurch movement happened to have also grown up at the same time as the big box store movement.
Yeah.
Like megachurches took off and Walmarts took off all at the same time.
Yeah.
And both of those, I have major issues with, but I'll keep it to church for a moment. And not to say that I don't shop at Walmart and all those as well. But the issue that has come out of the megachurch is this concern of trying to be, as you've already addressed, Blake, relevant and keep up with things. And I see the trajectory right now in some of those churches that are so production focused. Now what you're actually doing is you got to compete with Disney and Netflix and Amazon Prime. And sorry, we just don't have the dollars in any church. Some churches are keeping up a lot longer than others, but there comes a point where you can't.
Yeah.
And there comes a point where you can't just, what I have also seen, I've compared it to Chinese, spiritual Chinese food, where you eat it and you quickly just need to keep coming back for more because it doesn't leave you satisfied.
Yeah.
Play off the analogy if you want or not. But you keep having to come back and you actually have to keep raising the high, so to speak. So now your music and your smoke show and your lights have to get that much better continuously to feel the spirit. I'm putting in air quotes for our audio-only listeners. That I've got concerns about that. The way that we find Jesus, it should not be dependent on any level of performance and relevancy or modern expression. Those things always can be used as tools towards something. So I'm not saying we need to go back to Acts chapter 2. That's not possible. We live in a different time and culture. But I do think we need to question, what are the things that we can use within our modern time that can be pointing towards Jesus without having to be necessitated, and they themselves are the experience. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to jump in there and say, to the original question, is the church dying? Well, no. The church is built on Christ. It will never die. Like
Jesus gave us that promise.
If God is real, this thing's going to keep going. Now, how it looks will change, obviously.
It can get down to 12 guys. It's been there before. But it's not dead.
Right? But yes, that constant reminder as to what we're doing, right?
Yep.
We don't want to be so, I think some churches have missed it, that they would preach what you kind of said from an extreme point of view and be like, well, we're not worldly at all, right? We don't have drums, we don't have guitars, we don't have anything. We'll be the most boring church ever because we don't want to be like the world.
Yeah.
Well, you're going to have a hard time keeping people just even coming to church, right? Because that's just not fun for anybody.
Totally.
But on the other extreme is, the smoke show and the lights and is that, can you keep doing that, right?
Yeah.
So it's somewhere in the middle, but always trying to walk that dance. Like, how do we relate to culture? Because you have to be relatable.
Totally.
But how do you make the thing Jesus and not the thing?
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. I regularly think of Paul in Acts 17 when he's in Mars Hill. Like that is a cultural center at its time. And it's not just a religious center, cultural Roman center at the time for academics and learning and new ideas and stuff like that that's coming out. And he jumps in, he points to their statue of their God, uses their poetry to then point to Jesus.
Yeah.
And that should be the image of what we aim to do as churches all the time. And what we've done instead is we're stuck in this churchy language, disconnected from our culture. Most of us could live a life from birth to tomb, stuck within church bubbles and not even know what's going on outside of it. By the time you've got your Christian schools, your Sunday school, your Bible colleges, and then Christian organizations, I know there are people who live in the Christian industrial complex for their whole lives and don't know. Versus looking at Paul in that moment, he's got his finger on cultural things happening in that moment, is able to speak their languages with their medium and still point it towards Jesus. And I think we've forgotten that heart of being involved in our world and yet pointing to something better. So I use that as a perfect example. So can churches have podcasts? I hope so, because we're trying it. Do churches also need to keep meeting in a church building? I don't think so. Can you try other ways? Sure. But it's this hunger to try to bring the kingdom of God to people in whatever means necessary, and nothing else becomes its own focus to itself. So I've got concerns, sure, on certain preaching styles and certain church styles that I don't think are doing that. Does that mean they're wrong? No. But are they going to be the best way we can reach people? Maybe not. Is it easy to get caught in lights and smoke shows for themselves? Sure. But do I know people who do it on a weekly basis and they use it to point to Jesus? Absolutely. So there's no black or white, but I think sometimes we've just lost the heart of what we should be focusing on. And COVID, I think, COVID was a catalyst for the problems that were already existing. I don't think we have any new problems from COVID, other than, I think, and this again probably still already was something in the waters, the cultural, political allegiances that were made with churches that were maybe less spoken about, that became really prevalent through COVID. But even that, I think, is just a catalyzed problem, not a new one.
Well, and I'd say the one thing that, and again, I don't know if it was new because we've had churches on TV for as long as there's been TV.
Yeah.
But we definitely have a shift now where it's possible to, even in our own church, watch church at home very comfortably in my pajamas.
Totally.
And I don't see it as a major problem, but I see it as especially in a Western culture, this idea of doing Christianity individually.
Yep.
And that could be an issue that does come out of COVID a little bit, is that especially as even when I can't trust people because they're so mean to me, or, I don't like those people because they're on the other side of the line, pushes us again into this individualistic idea of doing Christianity.
Oh, totally.
And that one worries me. Like when I think of churches dying, I'm like,
Christian consumerism.
We're in real trouble if people buy into this idea that it's just me and Jesus.
Yeah.
Because they miss, like you've already alluded to, a grand part of the Bible, which is this idea of doing life communally and, sharing Jesus with other and loving other people, but also receiving love back, like all these things that help us live better, I think, and then just to go outside, maybe even in the Christian confines, that are better for mental health and better for spiritual growth and all those things. Like we need people. So I hope that COVID didn't damage too many people on that kind of idea. That's one thing that I saw come out of COVID that worries me a little bit.
I would argue maybe even still that's a continuation of a problem that was already going. Like,
well, it's with the adoption of the internet and social media. Yes, absolutely.
And before COVID, though, we still use the language of church shopping, which made it all about what do I get out of this environment versus that radical commitment to a community of people who are going to hurt you, who are going to let you down, and the commitment of A, in my own life, radical forgiveness, and B, refusing to also be mistreated. Not in a jerkish way, but when Jesus says, if somebody slaps you on your right cheek, turn and have them slap you on their left also, that's a refusal to also be treated as less than.
Right.
And so it's, no, I'm in a group of people who I'm committed to whether I like it or not every week. And when I get wronged, not if, when I get wronged, how are we going to work things out for their sake? Like, Blake, if you wrong me, which is never going to happen, let's play it the other way. If I wrong you, for my discipleship process, Blake, for you to call me higher and say, hey, you really offended me there.
Yeah.
Instead of be offended and walk away.
Totally.
If it's online, you can just walk away, turn off, and never have anything else.
Yeah.
For my discipleship process as a follower of Jesus who you say you care about through I'm committed to this community, calling me out in the most Christ-like way, and there's some tact that's needed on how to do that, you hopefully want to sharpen me.
Yeah.
That it's not just about where your feelings are, that to come in to approach me for my discipleship process and our church as a whole, each individual within it, I think also is really needed, that gets missed when it's individualist Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now I'm on a rant.
Well, it kind of leads into our next question. So if you're good, we'll skip ahead here. Are people generally quicker to jump into categorizing people? For example, if you don't agree with an ideology, you're automatically transphobic, or if you don't agree with their ideology, you're a fascist. Has the ability to respectfully disagree and have a polite discord died? I even see Christians doing this, and I'm curious to know your thoughts.
Yes. I'm looking for a book quick that I can point to, because that's, I feel like, I don't know what the right word is. That's my default. It's like, hey, I've got a book on this for you to explain more. It was a phenomenal book, but I can't find it right now. It must be somewhere else or tucked in one of my bottom shelves. Christians in the Age of Outrage.
Oh, yeah.
Which was just so good. And really, he said that culture itself is doing this, but Christianity is probably doing it better than anybody else, of the enemy-making machine, he called it, of we thrive on fear. And a lot of churches and language around religious expression do much better on fear than on invitation. So if we can make an enemy to unite against,
Yes.
it's a lot easier to bring people around.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
Than anything else. And we see this politically. We see this, I think, in a lot of language racially. We see this in a lot of different spaces. But I'm going to pick on the group of people that I'm a part of most, which is church. So yes, I think absolutely people are generally quicker to jump into categorizing people because it's also easier to write off somebody else and an idea by saying they're not this because of this. Though we joke and maybe we should stop. I have a couple people ask maybe we should stop calling each other heretics on the podcast out of jest, which I'm trying to become more sympathetic towards. But quickly I see much divisiveness amongst churches.
Yeah.
Can't deal with so-and-so, or we can't read so-and-so's books, or we can't play the music of such and such a church because they're X, Y, Z, which is a really easy way to write off a deeper conversation and the humility that is necessitated to actually question myself. And to say, maybe I disagree with them even on that point that I can easily write them off for. But what are the other 10 things that they could speak about in my life that I could really take some challenge on? And it's really left this assumption that I know best and I already know what I need to know and I don't need to change. I just need to look out and tell everybody else that doesn't.
Yeah.
And that is a really easy way to live as a human, to assume I've got things together.
Well, as you were speaking, the thought that came to my mind, and this is sick and twisted, but this is, I think, true.
Yep.
I just think if you put a group of people together in a room that don't know each other
Yep.
and try and get them to make friends,
Yep.
they might figure it out, right?
Yep.
Someone might take a lead, somebody might do it. But you put a group of people together and you get one guy who just decides to bully on the one person, you'll have friends right away.
Yep. Oh, totally.
Right? You just all of a sudden, like you said, you have this
Yep.
common alliance. Like, oh yeah, that guy is, weirder than me, and
Yep.
we're all normal. So now, now we have something to relate to
Yep.
and identify in.
Yep.
And I just feel like we identify in terrible characteristics much quicker than we do loving characteristics, right? And then you just play that out into society and you play it out in church and then you give us faith behind it and you're like, well, my God doesn't like sinners, so obviously that guy is terrible.
Yep.
And it just gets worse and worse and worse. It is.
Yep.
I don't know. I look at the end of this question. It says, have we lost the ability to respectfully disagree and have polite discord? I don't know. I'm not old enough to know, was there a time when this existed? Like, did people respectfully disagree and have...
I don't know if we've
better-
ever done it well, but I think we've done it better than we are now.
I mean, I think social media changes it because,
Yep.
again, now I can do it online and there's no immediate consequence to me.
Oh,
I
yeah.
can just send out hate and turn off my computer. Or
And the
whatever, right?
algorithms are literally feeding us stuff to reaffirm what we already believe.
Yes. So maybe it's heightened it, but when I think of sinful nature and what I believe about it in a biblical worldview, I just think people are evil. So
Yeah.
I'm like, they're going to always do the wrong thing.
Yeah.
But maybe it is worse. But I just see the other side of it. And I love being part of this podcast. I love being part of this church. I loved even just going through COVID with you guys. I've said this, I even said it last week. The challenge to love others, it's really hard.
Yep.
It is not something that I easily do by default,
Right.
but the reward of it is
Yep.
awesome.
Yep.
Like, I love it. I was in a discussion with my brothers this past week and it got heated.
Yep.
And I remember the thought that went through my mind is like, I'm totally okay if
Yep.
my brothers don't agree with me. Like, it does not hurt me in any way whatsoever.
Yeah.
One of my brothers probably wasn't thinking the same thing, but I just think, like, I think overall our society and especially Christians have, like, we've lost that ability. If we even had it, I don't
Yeah.
know. But we regularly don't fight to be
Yeah.
in the room with someone I disagree with.
Totally.
And yet we miss the blessing of that. We
Yeah.
miss the idea that I can love you anyways. We
Yeah.
we miss a place where we can forgive. Like you said earlier, if we have a problem and then we just walk away from it,
Yeah.
you never get any restoration out of that. You miss this whole biblical concept that Jesus seems to be all about.
Yeah.
Even as he's walking around doing these things that are radical and crazy, being with sinners,
Yeah.
he has this restorative way of just bringing them back into community.
Yeah. If Jesus had only hung out with people he agreed with, he would have been alone himself in 33 and a half years.
Yeah, we'd have a very boring Bible, right?
Totally.
So, yeah, like I don't know. I think we need to stay in the room so much more often.
Yep.
And and fight our own selfishness in that to be right or
Yep.
or have opinions that are that strong, but just be like, no, I can be okay
Yep.
if I disagree with them or they disagree with me.
Yep. I completely agree. I think we need to ask more questions
Yeah.
instead of give more answers. I remember the last Donuts in Discussion, we watched a Tim Mackey video, and he said, instead of trying to tell people about Jesus, why don't you start by asking them what they think about Jesus? And he said, at least 7 times out of 10, what you're going to end up being able to do is go, I don't believe in that Jesus either.
Yeah.
And get to start from a conversation of commonality. Maybe, again, what you're against. Maybe there's some good sides to that. But realizing we need to ask and understand people better. I do think, Blake, that we have gotten worse. One of the stats that jumps to mind, and I don't remember the numbers on it, but it was a massive jump of 2 generations ago. People had been polled about if your son or daughter married somebody who affiliated with the opposite political system.
Okay.
Wasn't a big deal then.
Yeah.
Now it's like a major cause for concern amongst parents of, but my kid would marry a Republican or a Democrat. Like, that's a massive concern to people on who their kids marry. So I do think it's getting worse in some areas.
I'd agree. I do feel that there's I would be foolish to say there's not heightened tension in our world right now, or in our Western culture anyways.
Yeah,
for sure.
So I think it is worse in a lot of ways, which is unfortunate. And I do think we're losing this ability to respectfully disagree. Because I would point back to social media. And I feel this happen to myself a lot of, you can go there and its job is to keep you on, which means it wants to back up the opinions you already have, to keep you enticed and feeling like you're right. And so we end up watching a lot of stuff that ends up reaffirming what we already believe. And so we walk away feeling better about it. So then we look even more so down on the people who disagree with us, because I've just watched 10 hours of such and such that told me for sure that this is the way it is. That I think it's doing a really massive disservice to our culture. And I look for those voices that are trying to do something in between. I may get written off even just saying this. I really enjoy listening to Joe Rogan's podcast on occasion. I feel like he's a pretty centrist guy that tries to do this well in culture. Yeah. And I'll be really honest that of course, I disagree with him massively on a lot of stuff, specifically around COVID. Right. But I think he's bringing on people who he regularly disagrees with and will push and ask hard questions on. And yes, he's not perfect at it, but he's trying. I feel like that's been the heart of this podcast. I know there was somebody who used this podcast as an example to their students within their classroom to watch how to agree to disagree. That this is something I've seen and I've been passionate about, but I don't know how to let those ripples get wider than us, other than just trying to put this podcast on and encourage and celebrate it where I see it in the world.
Well, I love the idea, and I mean, the whole podcast is built around that, but this idea of asking questions.
Yeah.
I can think like very specifically, an easy example is you talking about creation differently than what I was taught it in my church upbringing and by my parents, right? It was 7 days. It was literal. That was it. Yeah. And I remember the first podcast that you started doing, and my default would be to just go after you and correct you. Yep. Make some assumptions that you are really wrong and assuming what you believe and assuming all these things and then correct you in it. Yeah. And I probably did. But now thinking, no, like you said, the best way to do it is like, well, Kyle, what makes you think that? Or where did you come to this conclusion? Or all those things. I don't have to agree with you. I could still be like, no, that's crazy. Yeah. But at least I'm asking in a way that is like, you would feel valued. You'd feel like I'm listening to you. You'd feel like we're still friends. Yeah. Whereas if I just jump on you and tell you that your ideas are stupid and tell you why mine are right, I don't think we're friends anymore.
Yeah, totally.
Right?
And I think we lose that in our hurriedness also to get to what we really want to figure out right now so we can write somebody off justly. In one of my few wise moments in life, I remember in Abbotsford, big Bible Belt area when I was in Bible college, and I made a habit regularly of either writing sermons for the churches I was involved in or studying in public spaces, and often with my Bible out, which then often led to a lot of conversations. And I would have on a regular basis, Abbotsford is this really weird spot where it's both Bible Belt and also close to Vancouver, so hyper liberal all at the same time. Right. So there were a lot of people interested in having the conversation about Jesus and the gay community. Mm-hmm. And so I had a number of people approach me simply because I had my Bible out, whoa, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
And I made a rule for myself that I would refuse to have that conversation. I said I would ask people for 2 coffees. Only 2 people ever took me up for this. I will have 2 coffees with you. The first one, I wanted to get to know you and you to get to know me. The second one, we can have that conversation after that.
Wow.
And the 2 people that took me up on that, then all of a sudden, by the time we got to that conversation, they knew I wasn't a complete jerk.
Yeah.
They knew I didn't hate them. They knew that I had a family and a life beyond a screen name or a Bible on a coffee shop.
Yeah.
And I was a human all of a sudden, and I felt the same way towards them.
Yeah.
And that has been what's shifted a lot of my language and my sensitivity around that conversation in particular. My brother coming out and my close friends, some of my friends being out. All of a sudden, I'm talking about humans now. And I think so often we're speaking about issues
Yes.
and not the people that are attached to them. And so I think we miss that massively. That I think what we really need is more human connection, and this problem goes away.
Yeah.
Because I'm a lot less willing to talk about trans people if I don't know any.
Yeah.
Or once I know some, I mean.
Yes.
Right? I'm not going to use such language when I have a face to that name or whatever the conversation. I can't speak so ill of the other political side when I know I've got friends who are very deeply affiliated with that side. Because I go, that person's not a lunatic. Maybe there's something to that. And so I think human connection is really the issue at the root of this. We don't have it, so we talk blindly about issues. I've worked myself all the way around there.
No, I like it. I like it all. The next question is long, so why don't we call it a day?
Yeah.
And we will. Sorry, Keelan, I was getting my messages mixed up from you. You were shaking your head. No, I was like, yeah, it is. And then I realized what you're saying. You're agreeing. So we will call it a day. We'll jump in a couple of weeks. We will see you then.
See you, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
This has been the Living Springs Q&A podcast. If you have a question you would like answered or would like to learn more, visit us at livingspringsairdrie.com.